is Ron Underwood with Jessica here tonight. And Jessica, it's kind of thrilling to me to be able to interview you here right in my own backyard. You know, you're kind of the talk of the town around here. So, you know, I'd like to get to know you just a minute as a person. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Well, I was born in a little town called White Settlement. I've grown up in rural communities in Texas most of my life. I went to school in Godley, Texas for quite some time. And then moved into the suburb areas later as a teen. Spent a lot of time in Fort Worth and Dallas. I've spent a lot of time as a community organizer the past 2 decades of my life, really. My husband and I live in Denton now, where I am a student and a teacher at the University of North Texas.
Tell me a little about your education background. It's pretty fascinating to me because I have a master's in theology, you know, so.
So I am a scholar of theology and philosophy. I have spent the last 3 years researching the theological nature and origins of white supremacist ideology, the way that religion has been weaponized to sustain a white supremacist culture in the United States in particular. But what we have to understand is this is actually much older than the United States. So this is religious ideologies that developed out of the distinction and separation of Christianity from Judaism, the separation of the Occident and the Orient, which created a superior ideology of Christianity, of Abrahamic religion. And that, of course, gets developed later on into racializing Jewish people and the distinction of races, most notoriously with Kant. He was one of the first modern philosophers to use, to kind of merge these pseudosciences of race and Christian doctrine to normalize the idea of different races of human beings and superior races, which of course he tied back to what he argued was the purest form in a white Christian rule based on Gnostic theology is a big part of that. So I spent the last 3 years researching the ways that these Gnostic theologies were kind of reborn and resurgence in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially in the United States, in the South at the time of the Civil War. There was a lot of millenarianism born out of this kind of Gnostic theology and this obsession with creating a pure utopian society, which of course requires pure, perfect individuals. And so in order to do that, you have to be able to identify those pure, perfect individuals. And so this was part of the rise of the Civil War, and of course after the Civil War, this type of apocalyptic millenarianism in Christianity was very popular. It's what led to pieces of artwork like D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, which was reborn out of The Klansman, which was apocalyptic literature and prime. It idealized a white perfect society where black people were subservient and well-behaved to a white race. And this gets kind of born into modern culture, and it helped give a new birth to the second generation Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. Most people don't realize that the Ku Klux Klan is where we get this idea of a heroic masked figure in popular American society. So right now I'm earning a doctorate in philosophy, and these are the kinds of lines of research that I study. You know, the origins of white supremacy, the way that white supremacy has been normalized in our culture, and the kinds of new narratives that we need, a way of giving people new language to talk about human beings that doesn't have to be racialized language, so that we can dismantle systemic processes that are built and systemic institutions, systemic processes that were very much created and designed to sustain white supremacy.
You know, one of my observations is that racism kind of has these waves historically, and so we went through the Civil Rights Act, and everyone felt like we were making some progress, and we did make some progress, and then we enter into the 21st century, and I guess our enemy at that point is the Taliban or whoever. But then my observation is in 2008, when Obama was elected, we began to see this resurgence of white supremacy. It was almost like, everyone talked about, we've got a black guy running for president. He's such a good guy. And then when he was elected, they said, oh my God, he is a good guy. I just can't imagine he's a president, And so I kind of, this politics of resentment, where white people who didn't have a college education, who hadn't made it to the Senate, all of a sudden felt like, maybe this is going too far or something. It's hard to explain that dynamic, but we've certainly seen a resurgence of open racism since then, it seems.
Well, we can explain that dynamic, and we can look at history to do it. For instance, it's nothing new, and I think you've brought up a really important observation, because what we have seen historically is this battle between those who are pushing for progress, and so when there's a push for progress, there's a natural push against it, right? And so that's what we've seen in U.S. history, because we've never really addressed the problem. Anytime we think I think progress is a lie. We've never truly addressed the issue. Reconstruction in the South failed.
Yeah.
In the years following the Civil War, during the Reconstruction, there were more African American people in levels of leadership positions at the local, state, and federal level than we have to this day,
right.
And we have never reached that level again in modern history.
Right.
And as a result of that insurgence of black leadership, there was a response to that in the South.
Yeah.
And that response was the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah. Right.
Confederate soldiers who came home went to war again in their local communities to squash movements where black people were pushing to enact their rights.
Yeah.
And we saw it at the federal level as well, where at some point there was a compromise in federal government, and we start to see less black people in federal positions. And so then, we have this pendulum swing throughout history. We saw it again in the 1920s, in the early 20th century, in the early 20th century, when black and brown communities all across the South were gaining new levels of economic independence, free of white endorsement. Communities like Quakertown in Denton, Texas, communities like Greenwood in Tulsa, and I know there were communities here in Cook County. We're just now starting to scratch the surface at some of those communities that existed here in Gainesville, but have been erased and eradicated. I just learned recently there was a Quakertown in Gainesville, a black community that used to live and thrive right here in Gainesville.
Didn't know that.
But they were eradicated the same way these other communities were. And this is every town in Texas. This is every small town, every small community. So, and we see the same thing, in the 1950s and 60s, the Civil Rights era. The Ku Klux Klan resurges again, and you have these extreme groups that come out to push against progress.
Why? Can you give me a bottom line why?
Because their ideology is ingrained with their identity.
It's kind of a tribal trait, right?
They don't. How can you, when everything you've ever learned about your very identity as a white person is embedded in a false historical narrative, a pseudo-mythological history, this lost cause ideology that has been ingrained into every aspect of Southern heritage, Southern identity. When there's a challenge to that, it's not just a challenge to your ideology in general, it's a challenge to your very identity.
Yeah. It's not just a cultural challenge, it's a challenge to your ego in a way.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so quite frankly, I get irritated when people say, why can't they just acknowledge racism exists? It doesn't take anything away from you to acknowledge that you have white privilege. Well, actually it does. We have seen time and time again that to stand out and say, yes, I have white privilege, yes, I need to use that privilege to help dismantle white supremacy, to help create spaces for black voices, and help. Now, sometimes white privilege means shutting up. Sometimes white privilege means stepping out of the way. Sometimes it means when you're standing in a room full of black people at a city hall meeting, who gives a shit if you got there first? Make sure everybody who's there to speak on their experience as a black individual, minority in your community, make sure they get to go first, because quite frankly, we've had the floor long enough.
Yeah.
So it means we all have to sacrifice a little bit, because there will be no real progress made for racial equality if we keep expecting black people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Right.
Everybody has to be, there are people who want to step forward, but at the same time, what we have to understand is those with the most privileges in the front, we have to step back. That is compromise.
Right.
That is the only way we can compromise, is by recognizing that we are already starting 5 feet ahead.
Yeah. That's interesting. I've stopped using racial equality and started talking about racial equity.
Absolutely,
because,
that's great.
Equality is kind of just a ethereal thing that one thing, where equity has this power component. This is all about power,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Not just political power, but social power and personal power,
Yeah.
right? And so it's hard when people are very resistant to power dynamics changing, and particularly when a lot of people, have a need to have someone that they feel superior to.
Yeah, we were talking about it last night, actually. I think was it Emmeline that brought it up. We have a lot of well-trained narcissists in white communities. We have a lot of well-trained white men as well-trained narcissists, and a lot of white women trained to be really fragile.
Yeah.
We joke about Karens, right? What I think is critical is that white women especially start stepping forward, because the vast amount of brutality being committed against black and brown bodies by white men is being done in the claim of defending white women. So we are complicit. We are the most complicit, and we have the most power, actually.
Right.
We just have to choose to use it for good.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I was talking about, I saw Zen a couple of weeks ago, and I was interviewing her, and I was telling her the speech she gave, the first or second rally I came to, such a powerful speech. And I said, Zen, what I really liked about that was not your talking about racial equity, but your power as a woman.
Yeah.
Because she has claimed that power.
Yeah, I love her. I could listen to her speak all day long. I think white people, white women especially, but white people have a lot to learn from black women.
Tell me a little bit, it's no secret here that there's a lot of angst and resentment about your particular style in what you do. Tell me a little bit about that, and the intentionality behind that, and what rationalizes that?
Listen, anybody who wants to come at me and say that I don't have a legitimate message because I say fuck or shit is looking for an excuse to delegitimize my message. Anybody who says I don't have a legitimate message because I raise my voice is just looking for an excuse. Because here's the deal. People who want to claim that I go out and just call everyone a racist, everyone's a white supremacist. You're a white man, I'll call you a white supremacist. I've had very pleasant talks with you on multiple occasions. Have I ever cursed at you
I don't think so.
or said anything ugly or hateful to you? No. And I've had...
I'm married. I'm used to it,
And I've had good conversations with police officers out there, too. I don't go out there and berate every officer I come into contact with. I've had very intimate conversations on my live feeds where I thank officers for making choices that I knew were difficult for them, that were good choices. Unfortunately, I don't get to have those conversations as often as I would like to. Because unfortunately, most of the white people that I'm out there dealing with are the ones who are out there using racial rhetoric, holding white supremacist tributes, like Confederate flags once carried by the Ku Klux Klan and Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. Most of the people that I'm out there confronting are people who are holding weapons for the purpose of intimidating and terrorizing black and brown people in their own community. Some of them aren't even from this community. They came in and drove a long way to terrorize black and brown people. So I would say this. Sometimes I'm in a battle zone. Sometimes I need to puff up and I'm facing a bear.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have to make them laugh and remind them that I'm human. Sometimes I get to be in an intimate conversation with someone who's willing to have an intimate conversation, and I relish those opportunities. But what I'm out there doing is saying, your racism isn't welcome here, it's not welcome anywhere. And I think it's time that people who want to go out and act like that feel uncomfortable. And if I make you uncomfortable, it's probably because you're racist.
So it's a subtle difference maybe, but do you see yourself as calling out racism or revealing racism?
Yes?
Both.
Yeah, I think that it's important, and we have an obligation to identify it and to expose it. And I talked about this earlier today. You know, I am just as hard on myself as I am everyone out there. I constantly check myself. I ask myself, why am I saying this? Why am I thinking this? Did I just make an assumption of this person based on this? And I'm constantly having to check myself to make sure, am I prioritizing black leadership's wishes right now? Am I looking to black leadership, or did I just assume to know what they want? And checking my privilege to say, you know, is there a better way I could be spending this money? You know?
Let me ask something, Jessica, because
Yeah.
I guess in the age of Trumpism, I finally, after years and years, I've spent so much of my life trying to change the minds and hearts of people, and I found myself just failing disastrously, time and time again, and particularly in the political environment where everyone is so polarized and solidified, and so I've stopped trying to just talk about true things, even just what is evidence and what's truth with a lot of people. And so I had this thought the other day, and I want to see what you think about it, because I finally decided I really don't care if every single member of the Gainesville Police Force is a Ku Klux Klaner, as long as they treat any black man that they encounter the same way they treat me. That I'm not going to be able to change how they think or feel, but they should behave in a way that's not racist.
But that's not going to happen. People are always going to act in according to how they feel and according to their understanding of reality. And people are always going to act in accordance with their morality and their values. So where I've come to, this is where I've come. I teach to those who come to learn. I teach in universities. I've held lectures on public courthouse squares. And people who want to learn about the systemic nature of racism will come to learn. I put opportunities out to make that happen as much as possible. I don't try to teach those who don't come to learn.
Yeah.
When I'm out here at these streets, at protests, standing with black and brown leaders who are being surrounded by police officers who have made it clear that their safety is not priority, by white militia members who've made it clear that their safety is not priority and that they are there to terrorize and sustain white supremacy. I'm not there to teach.
Yeah.
What I'm there to do with my live stream is model anti-racist activism for other white people, because more white people need to come out and stand beside black leaders and say, what you're doing, white supremacist, is wrong. What you're doing, white supremacist, is racist. Officer, you are not equally enforcing the law. Officer, you are terrorizing this community. Chief Kevin Phillips, stop terrorizing PRO Gainesville leaders by sending cops out to their homes. And I'm modeling that behavior for other white people to come out and do it with me, because if they did, we wouldn't have to do it so much.
Right.
If more people would stop being complicit and silent, if more white people would use their privilege to come out and accept the fact that they're going to face some backlash for it.
Well, I certainly
We wouldn't
agree.
have to
I
do
certainly
it.
agree with that. You know, my own demographic. I don't have a lot of friends actually. I'm just not that kind of person. But a lot of acquaintances and people in my demographic, older and who have, you know, have had successful careers or whatever. You know, I just want them to be able to raise their voice a little bit, because, you know, I found it's extremely hard if you're a white person to understand white privilege and to understand structural racism,
Sure.
because, you know, we're just in this little pinhole view of the world that's created by white racism. I'm so interested in the commissioner's deal. You know, none of them talked about the statue. They talked about Antifa in Chicago, and one thing else, they didn't even address the issues.
Anything but addressing what black and brown
Right.
people are saying right here in their
Right.
very own community.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, I am pretty passionate on the fact that you have to take a risk every once in a while, and, you know, if you don't want to go on the streets and march, that's fine. Find another way to speak out. But first, people have to understand, you know, a lot of people support that statue being up there, and they say they're not racist at all. They need to re-examine that. You know, they look at that from, you know, or so many white people say, it's been there my whole life. It's never bothered me, doesn't bother me now. I don't see any reason to stay there. They cannot do that empathizing where they can look at that statue in the eyes of a black person or a black child or a black mother trying to explain that to them.
Here's a prime example. PRO Gainesville put those nooses up on the courthouse square next to that monument. And you would have thought, we know that the commissioners tried to turn that into a threat targeted at them. White people responded in vitriol, appalled. They couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
They thought it was terrible. But what the black people in Gainesville have been saying for the last several months, and for long before the last several months, it's only because they've been getting support from outside the community that the community has had to start recognizing what they're saying, right? But what black people have been saying is that monument is a monument to people who used nooses to hang their ancestors. We know this. They are the people who use nooses to hang white people in mass in this community for refusing to fight for the Confederacy.
Exactly.
And so for black people to drive by that monument, they might as well see a dozen nooses hanging on the courthouse lawn.
Yeah, it represents the same ideology.
That is the visceral response that white people felt when they saw those nooses, is the response and the feeling that black people have been experiencing as long as that monument has been there, their entire lives. And they've been told, oh, it's fine, it's not racist.
And no one intends any harm to you. Well, listen, Jessica, I can't say much. I appreciate this. This has been fun. I'm going to save a little bit of my battery life here for the protest. But,
I'm your biggest fan, Ron.
well, I really enjoy talking to you, and I hope I have your permission to share this video.
Yeah, I hope you will.